Good afternoon, Professor Chris Alden, and do you hear me now, loud and clear?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. We're just gonna move it over here. Okay, guys, let's start, please. Thank you very much. Okay, first of all, apologies for the delay and then the sound issues. Okay, first of all, thank you very much. Okay, so I'll start again. Thank you very much for both of the people from LSE, for sharing your time with us, and then of course the professors from ESIC University as well. Okay, to be able to discuss about the book that they've written about China and Latin America. Okay, so this is essentially what we're going to discuss about. It was published in December 2022, so it's very, very recent. And then so what I'll do is I'll start with introducing all of the panelists. So I'll start with Professor Chris Alden. He teaches international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences, and he's also the director of LSE Ideas, which is a think tank that analyzes foreign policy. Okay, he is also the research associate at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and then he's written a lot of books related to China and Africa relations, and a lot of internationally recognized journals as well. Okay, and then he's had fellowships at the Cambridge University, University of Tokyo, and also the Ritsumeikan University. Okay, and then now I'll move on to the second person, which is Dr. Alvaro Mendez. Okay, who is a senior research fellow and the director of LSE Global South Unit, and he is also the academic director for the short programs at LSE Ideas. He's also the adjunct professor and foreign expert at the Institute for Global Public Policy at Fudan University in Shanghai. Okay, so both of them have written this book together, and then this is the key topic for our masterclass today as well. Okay, and then now I'll move on to the third person, who is Professor Jesus Centenera from ESIC University. All right, so he holds a PhD in contemporary history, and he also has an advanced management program from the EIC Business School. He's traveled extensively, and then he holds a lot of expertise related to Russia, China, the US, and Middle East. Okay, and he's teaching over here at the postgraduate and undergraduate level. Okay, and then now I'll move on to Professor Andres Gomez. He's the Vice Director of International Relations over here. He has a PhD in Political Science and International Relations from the Autonomous University of Madrid. He also has an advanced program in International Economy and Global Leadership from Harvard University, and also an European Political Transformation course from the London School of Economics. Again, he's also extensively traveled to 78 countries, and then he shares a very holistic approach as well. Okay, so here, before we get started, I just wanted to give you a little bit of context related to the book. Okay, so here, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that you've had 6 years of field work in being able to gather the research and then writing the book. Is that correct, Professor?
That is correct.
Okay, perfect. And then here, what I want you to do now is we'll do it like the Davos style format. Okay, so everybody will be given at least 5 minutes to be able to show their perspective related to the topic. And then we're going to start with a few discussions. And at the end, we're going to ask the audience for their questions as well. Okay? All right. So if we may start with you, Professor Chris Alden.
Yep, looking forward to it. Okay, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here virtually in this case with ESIC. And let me talk a little bit about some of the part of our findings and part of our drive behind this particular book. One of the things was to give it a historical context. It's a relationship with a very long historical tale, as we would say. It's been one that has been fundamental to the shaping of globalization as we know it. The modern era of globalization is built upon this sort of relationship. And yet, at another level, until recently, it's a history that's neglected, if not forgotten. So recognizing that Spain and Portugal, when they went out to seek out markets and resources in Asia, that they were looking for China in particular. The Western Hemisphere, the conquest of Latin America was very much part of that. But really, the aim was to secure access to those markets. And for 200 years, they dominated the trade, and Latin America was a key feature in the resource exchange for finished goods and markets. And that shaped our global today. Our contemporary has that deep layered roots. So that was one of the things we wanted to bring to the fore. The second one was to comment on the more recent history as well, looking at how the Cold War, China was present and part of the Cold War experience of Latin America, and it shaped that near contemporary period. And then, of course, our most recent foray into country case studies was to look at the Chinese role in the various countries within Latin America to develop and demonstrate the different policies that were pursued, how development may have been the key driver, but that there's a degree of agency, which my colleague will speak about, and geopolitics, which shape that relationship. So that's my sort of intervention on this. Over to Alvaro.
Thank you so much, Chris, and my colleagues. Very good to see you virtually. I see myself twice here, but good to be here with you and to talk about our book, which, by the way, just correction, it came out in January, not in December, but we've been working on it 6 years, probably more than that. We spent time in both in the region of Latin America, but also in China, discussing some of the issues. Some of the interviews were actually held in Spain and in the US as well. So we've been working on that for a long time. And so this is purely based on fieldwork combined with theory. But one of the things that we do at the LSE, we not only write theory, we try to bridge the gap that exists between theory and reality. And of course, we've been trying to do that as much as possible. The topic is very current. Everyone is talking about China and Latin America for a number of reasons. The geopolitical situation with the US, the tensions that they have had, but also the fact that China is a fairly new actor in Latin America. I said fairly because, as my colleague Chris Alden mentioned, there is a lot of history. We can go back to the 19th century and even before, during the colonial period as well, some Chinese interaction with the region. But of course, the history in most contemporary times goes back to the 1950s, and some countries established diplomatic ties with China as early as 1960. That was the case of Cuba, and this has been happening every year. And in fact, you've probably seen in the news that Honduras just switched diplomatic ties from Taiwan to China last week, actually. So this is an interesting period because now we have a total of 26 countries in the region who have diplomatic ties with China. Why is that important? There are 33 countries in Latin America. That means there are 7 who actually have diplomatic ties with Taiwan instead. And again, why that matters? It matters for the following reason. Taiwan only has 13 diplomatic relations at the moment, as of today, 7 of which are now in Latin America. So Latin America is comprising more than 50% of Taiwan's diplomatic ties. And of course, this creates tensions. The US is involved. As we speak, the president of Taiwan is now en route to visit Guatemala and Belize because she's so sort of trying to balance the situation between Taiwan and China, but also the US. But this goes beyond just the region. It also has to do with geopolitics, the politics of the powerful states, and we underline this particular issue that is not just new states trying to establish diplomatic ties with China. And of course, some of the other things that we investigate, apart from the history, geopolitics, trade and investment. China is becoming one of the most important trading partners with the region. If you can imagine an apple, actually a pizza pie, or an apple, China is having more and more bites of the apple. But if you think of the relationship as a pizza pie, the pizza pie used to be basically the US. But as we move with time, China has more and more slices of that pie. In fact, as of today, China is already the largest trading partner of Brazil, Uruguay, Peru, and Chile. And it is already the second most important trading partner of many of the other countries. So that's a very important element. Opportunities as well as challenges for the region. We have one of the most important reservoirs of natural resources, including key minerals like lithium, copper. So China is very interested in that, but also the US, especially right now with the lithium sort of race, the lithium triangle, which is comprised by Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. And of course, also in terms of global governance. Now we have multilateral development banks that are providing funding to the region, and that includes two Chinese development banks, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which now has 6 members from the region, and the new development bank, which you might have heard of as the BRICS Bank, which obviously had Brazil as a founding member, but also is in Uruguay is in the process of joining that particular organization. So new avenues for funding, exciting times for the region, but also quite challenging because we are not prepared to deal with China. And we lack the strategic views that we need to deal with China in a better way. So this is one of the issues that we also highlight in the book. China has very clear idea what they need to do or what they want to do, and Latin America not so much. So we try to emphasize that. And as part of our research, we have been able to advise foreign ministries on how to best approach the issue of China. In Latin America, interestingly so, the foreign ministry strategy, in most cases, is handled by lawyers. No offense, my wife is a lawyer, but we need to go beyond international law in order to deal with China. We need experts on business, experts on international issues, geopolitics to be able to deal with these challenges and also the opportunities for sure. So finally, my final point is diversity. We are talking about 33 countries, as I mentioned before. Every single country has a different story. And as I'm sure some of you are from Latin America, we are not all the same. I go to the US, I'm Colombian, and people ask me, oh, you're from, I say, I'm from Colombia. People, oh, I'm Mexico. I say, no, I'm from Colombia. Same with the uniqueness of some of these countries. We have to look at the relationship in that sense to make sure that we understand the variables and where they're going. And obviously China has a different relationship with Chile and Peru that the one that they may have with Honduras. But one thing that China has very much good clarity is in getting countries to endorse the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, which Chris and I have been studying the BRI for years, and we still don't know what it is, because I don't think China even knows what it means. Having said that, there are 21 countries in the region out of those 33, and out of the 26 who have diplomatic ties with China. There are 21 countries that have endorsed the BRI. The interesting point is who has not endorsed the BRI, and that would be Mexico, USA, Colombia, USA, the Bahamas, USA, and Brazil, which I think is not the US. I think there are strategic issues that go beyond just the USA relationship. So yeah, I think that's what I have to say about the book. Buy it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. So if I may just invite Professor Kaku. Come here.
Hello. So what has China to see with you? Most of you, the only thing know about China is the mom and pop store corner shop run by the Chinese. Some of you may even have traveled to China, but being university students, you're going to face them as the main world competitor. I'm too old for that. I won't see that, but I'm sure China is going to be present in your professional life because they are expanding and expanding quickly. I think there are 3 waves. The first one is the individual Chinese worker, hard worker, who has this corner shop, and they're everywhere. I don't know if you know that ESIC is run, actually the board is a Catholic institution. They have Catholic missions in South America, and in Africa. I had the opportunity to be with Naroa at Mozambique, at the Catholic mission, which, by the way, I invite you to consider as a possibility. Not only the Erasmus, but also go there for a month, cooperate, see another reality of life. And I was so shocked to see the corner shop that was run by Chinese. And then I went to do consultancy in Ecuador, and in a small village, not Quito or Guayaquil, at Manta, there were Chinese corner shop. So that's the first wave. And it's independent, and it's individuals trying to make a living, hard worker immigrants. Second one is related with the government, and this is mastermind. They have a difference, is very hierarchical society, collective, and they have a dictatorship, and we have to call the things by their name. But this dictatorship is very intelligent. They have made a bet almost 40 years ago to develop industrially, but at the same time to get raw materials around the world. And the same thing that they did in Africa, they're doing now in Latin America. I'm not criminalizing anybody. Who am I to say so? The only thing I'm saying, I see a reality, and most of the books I have read, and I'm eager to read this book too, points in the same direction. It is not only the lithium triangle, it is much more, is buying raw materials around the world. But let me tell you what they did in Africa. They say, we're not going to cooperate. This is no NGO whatsoever. We will build a port for you, but you allow us to take cobalt from your mines. We will help you with mining, energy, infrastructures. They take full planes full of Chinese workers, go to the country, and change the country. If I'm a third world country, or as they call it now, emerging country, oh, be my guest. You come here, you build infrastructure, you give me more energy, you buy my foodstuffs, anything you want, sir. In the last 20 years, Xi Jinping has been 11 times in South America, visiting several countries. When you don't travel to see your customers, somebody will sit in your plane in the seat where you were going to be seated. And the Chinese are traveling, signing accords. And now 1/3 of all the exports from Chile are going to China. I'm going to talk later about Brazil, but now only the overview. When the Europeans decided they don't want to trade anymore with Russia because of the outrageous invasion of the Ukraine, the Chinese say, great. Xi Jinping has been now in Moscow. Chinese cars were 9% of the total sold in the Russian Federation. Now is 36%. Chinese cell phones have 75% of the Russian market. The point is that they're aiming in certain directions, exporting goods. Most of us associate the Chinese with the poor, cheap products. Not anymore. And you're going to find more technology. And what I'm saying is that there is a plan. We don't have any plan. How many times has been the German chancellor in South America, or the French president, or the president of the United States? What is our plan? Because they have a clear plan. Oh, we need lithium for the batteries, and that amounts for 2/3 of all the lithium processed in the world is done in China. And again, I'm not criminalizing anybody. The plan is logical. We're going to sign agreements with everybody. I think except for Paraguay in all South America, in the southern part, without counting Mexico, is the only one recognizing nowadays Taiwan. But the point is they have made agreements with everybody, and they're buying huge amounts. And only the China Railway, China Oil Offshore, and China Energy Communications Company, they have invested more than 13 billion, remember it's American billion, so it's 13,000 million, in the region. The point is they have a plan, they implemented it, and it's legal. Everything they're doing is legal. I'm buying shares, I'm making agreements, and they're building in Duisburg a huge terminal and warehouses for the new train for the Silk Road. They're doing the same thing in Belgium so that they can get a bigger port, so that they can get the good things coming from China. My point is they have a plan. I think the Western world don't have a plan. That we have a political system which is interwoven with an economic system, and individuals, companies, and persons will try to sell. And I think this is a different game. And you have to learn the rules of the game if you want to compete in the future.
So thank you so much, Professor Alden, Álvaro, Professor Centenera. In my case, Álvaro, nobody's perfect, but I'm a lawyer. And through my perspective, and considering and having the opportunity to work and live in China, I'm the most important or the biggest American countries. We need to consider and we need to understand geopolitics is incredibly important. Every day I'm trying to introduce the idea to our students, but what about the geopolitical business? Why do things happen? Why do we need to? And how we as Spaniards and future Spanish professionals, we could understand the system. We need to allow them to understand how the future will be in order to be capable to ride the wave, because otherwise the wave will not be capable to provide them with a future, with a clear future for them. So additionally, or a critical important for me is which will be the role of Spain in this situation. Could we play a better or a more important role as a facilitator between China and Latin America? In addition to that, and for sure, something we have the opportunity to discuss, Professor Mendez and myself, regarding since 2006, which is the critical moment or the linchpin where the Chinese investments were multiplied by 1,000 till nowadays. Just in the last year, from 2020, 2021, 2022, every year the Chinese investments in the region grows more than 20%. But at the end, we are present there with a huge number of Spanish companies that they are working there. How we can trade, how we can beneficiate from the situation, how we can move from just an extractive relation where the Chinese were just focused on buying raw materials to be capable to create a fruitful bilateral relations, and instead of being the ones who sell the raw materials, be the ones who provide second type of products and services, because they can, we can, and for sure the future maybe also. And another question I would like to raise on the floor is that maybe do we need to rise some the role of multilateralism in the case of Latin American countries, and why there are more united perspective in a relation, in a global relation with the Chinese, could facilitate easier or a better relation between China and the region? Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for all your contributions. So in this case, I mean, I think like a lot of key concepts have been brought up into the table, all right? So if we want, let's first discuss this idea of what has been posed as the role of both of these regions first. Okay, so I know like over the next decade, okay, both Europeans, Chinese, and even the Latin region or countries in those regions will be sort of involved in this. So here, what do you believe? To what extent do we need to intervene in this process? So here, I remember like Dr. Alvaro Mendez, he mentioned this thing about how Mexico, how Colombia, for example, they're essentially considered the backyard of the US, and then therefore they're very protective about it. And then at the same time, opening, like Spain being the gateway to have a more familiar or a more less cannibalizing sort of relationship between Latin America and China. Okay, so here, so what would you say about that?
I'm gonna get started simply because you mentioned my name before. I mean, the role of different regions has to be more proactive. Both the US and the European Union have taken the region for granted. China is overpassing them in terms of, for example, to give you an example, Mercosur trade. China is going to overtake the European Union. And of course, there's no reaction about that. And in the case of Mexico, of course, their trade with the US is very important. The renegotiation of NAFTA into the new agreement that Trump put forward, it's going to make things more difficult for Mexico to have any agreement with China. We already have 3 free trade agreements with China, Chile, Peru, and Costa Rica. A 4th one has been negotiated. And I think that's key for the countries to get a better deal with China. But I think it is very important that countries start thinking that not all roads lead to Washington and not all roads lead to Beijing. I think it is very important for countries to think about this international relations strategy as to put their eggs in various baskets, not just one region. And I think Latin America has that opportunity. The problem is how they're going to execute this, because the mentality is very short-term oriented. In many ways, the legacy of Spain and Portugal, which is a reality. The Mañana syndrome, as I call it in one of my books. So we have to engage with these different actors in multilateral organizations, I have written extensively on Chinese multilateral organizations, but also organizations from the region, development banks. We do need the funding for sure. Latin America has one of the worst infrastructures in the entire world. In fact, we invest in infrastructure less than Sub-Saharan Africa. So it is really bad. We need the funding for infrastructure, but we don't have it. Therefore, some of this funding is important, but we need to make sure that this does not become in a predatory relationship, in which, of course, the main beneficiary would be China and not the region. But it is certainly a challenge. And just to end, the role of Spain and Portugal is key here too, in the sense of Ibero-America. And just a curious note to add is that Chinese policymakers actually put together Spain and Portugal with Latin America in many instances because of the language. In 2018, one of the trips of Xi Jinping to the region, he actually went, it was Beijing, Lisbon, Buenos Aires, Panama, Madrid on the way back. So it's really interesting how they put together that. But also to end with the fact that China is on top of things. China has been, Xi Jinping has been more times to more countries in Latin America than Obama, Trump, and Biden combined. So that's pretty incredible, to be frank with you. So we need to get that attention from Europe and that attention from the US as well. Chris.
Thanks. To add to that, I think one of the troubling features, we talk about predatory, is not just the investment into the resource sector, which is a natural part of the economic exchange you would see, but insofar as middle income countries in Latin America have had a manufacturing industry, services and the like, we see deindustrialization. We see actually steps backwards, things that are not. So you look at soybeans, you look at other areas. They're not being. There is some secondary processing going on, but this trend is a downward trend for the Latin American economies, and that's very worrying. Losing some of the gains of the last decade. So again, I'm making generalizations. There'll be some countries where we see differences, some improvements, but it's if you look at the aggregate statistics, the trend is downward. So that tells me exactly what my colleagues at ESIC had said, which is that there's no plan. There's no sort of response. So let me end with that comment and hand it over to them.
Quick one again about Spain and the European Union. Deforestation is bad, sounds so, no? To burn the Amazonas and to have more harvest looks bad. Well, that's what the European Union thought. And we were buying the second main export from Brazil is soybeans. And European Union put a legislation saying we don't want this soy to come from deforestation. There were like 200,000 hectares, then it went down to 51,000, then it went down to 29,000. We're still buying from Brazil, but we want to save the Amazonia. We're so nice. The Chinese came and says, how much do you sell? There's now 229,000 hectares affected by deforestation of the soybean that it's been imported by China. They didn't say, like the Americans, by the way, the Kyoto Protocol. The point here is that we have arrived to some rules, which in fact, they're very good, but if you're the Chinese government and you say, what do I need? Oh, I need raw materials, I need mining, I need anything that will be good for China, and it's going, again, I said that they're playing with our cards, with our rules. But when you say, what is the role that we may play? I keep thinking of the Brexit, how the British shoot their own foot. I mean, it's so stupid. You need to be big to compete, and we need to compete closer to each other. The problem here is that if I'm a European company, Spanish company, trying to do things in Latin America, first I need an agreement between the European Union and South America. Then I need to compete in a tender in a highly corrupted area. Then I have to win it, and then I have to start working on it in a tender with several people. If I'm a Chinese company, money is not an issue. The state banks are going to provide the funds that they need to do it. They're going again to bet for the things that are important for them, and they're going to do business to business. There are some huge companies in China, even independent private companies, depend on the government one way or another. So I think that we're playing this game with a keeper leg, and I don't think that we can do a lot of things. The only thing we can actually do is to cooperate more with the Americans and within the European Union to try to cooperate and try to learn the lessons. The rules have changed, and we haven't still got the new rules.
Okay, perfect. So in this case, just to state a few things, all right? So then what I'll do is I'll pass on a few questions from the audience, okay, if that's okay. But I mean, overall, my understanding is that, and then thank you very much for stating that. I think a lot of us probably didn't know this, perhaps, is that the Chinese policy, or at least in the policy-making style for the Chinese people, they sort of clump Spain and Portugal together with all of Latin America. So here, in this case, of the role of Spain being the gateway is essentially almost neglected, okay? So here, what I'll do is, before I take any questions from the audience, all right, I'll just pose one last question, okay, which is to state more related to the mutually beneficial relationship, because I know that you mentioned this thing about the predatory relationship between the two regions. So in this case, to what extent do you believe this is thrusted upon China because it's considered the factory of the world? So essentially, because if they have to manufacture all of these things, therefore they need to have a better plan in order to be able to efficiently mine a lot of these resources, be it from Africa or be it from Asia, or even the role that the European nations or even the US nations have to play in this case. Okay, so while the panelists are answering that, I'll invite some people from the audience to think of some questions, and then just raise your hand, and my colleague Pablo, he will come to you with a microphone, and then we'll take your question. Okay?
Well, why don't I jump in first and then hand it to Alvaro? I think that there is a role here for the governments of Latin America. I mentioned in my last remarks, and a colleague at ESIC did as well, about the absence of a plan there. There is, in many respects, what governments have done is they have taken the resources, the development finance, as a link to export of a fixed number of, for instance, oil products or soybeans or one of the others. And that in that context, they've also encouraged Chinese firms to bring their own labor there. They haven't set conditions. They haven't said, you know, it's important for us for you to hire our companies. It's important for you to employ our locals to produce this road, to develop this infrastructure project. So I think that in examining and critiquing the Chinese, I mean, they're seeking the smoothest path, right? And if there are no obstacles put and no conditions put, they're going to take the easiest road to fulfilling their interests. So we also need to place some sort of put under scrutiny the role of Latin American governments and the degree to which they really stand up for the development interests of their own people. Alvaro.
There we go.
For sure, I do agree with what you are saying, and I think the relationship with China has to be seen as a strategic bilateral relationship as well, because we don't play ball as a group. Going back to the question about China being the factory of the world, yeah, companies love it. Companies in the US absolutely love it. When we had the trade disruptions and everyone was pulling out of China, for example, Apple didn't want to hear that because, of course, they depend on China. But with the crisis that we have learned one thing, but I don't know if they're going to learn it really properly, is that we cannot necessarily depend on China for everything. And I think American companies are seeing that. Everyone has been talking about nearshoring. And who do you think will be the ideal candidate for nearshoring? Obviously, Latin America. The problem, though, is that it sounds like a great idea in principle, but in reality, we don't have the technology that China has. We are way behind, mainly because China opened to the world in the late 1970s. People think that these factories came out of the blue in the last 10, 20 years. China has been doing this since the late 1970s, and they have had investment from the region. So we need to make sure that we see these opportunities here. Perhaps the only country in the region who could provide some of the high-end technology would be Costa Rica, to be able to gain properly from these opportunities and from these trade disruptions. So the private sector, Chris talks about the importance and the responsibility of the public sector, equally goes for the private sector. Because if they don't start looking for opportunities and also supplies, and I'm talking about the US and Latin American countries, you're going to end up in a similar situation with what we had during COVID and what we have had with the war in Ukraine. And it's very important to realize that things that are happening really far away have an impact in your own surroundings. That's, geopolitics. If ships cannot go through the Suez Canal, they're not going to get to Latin America or the Malacca Strait and so on. So that's important for all of you students who are dealing with this to think about that these geopolitical issues do have an impact in businesses as well. So there is a responsibility for them to tackle that as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So what I'll do is I'll take some questions from the audience. Is there anybody that wants to ask a question? Just let us know and Pablo will move over. If not, I'm happy to ask a question myself. Okay, we have a...
Thank you. Zlatko, professor from Croatia. So can one of the speakers say, how is China managing to produce, for example, a bridge in Croatia was a tender and they offered half the price of any European or world competitor. How do they manage to sell to build something on half of price comparing to anybody else? Okay. Is that they pay the workers much less? So what are the reasons for their dominance?
What I'll do is I'll repeat the question so that you can hear it. Okay,
Please.
so in this case, it's Professor Zlatko. All right, so he's from Croatia. He is posing the question that, for example, how is China, like at an economic stage, be able to produce things at essentially half the price and still be able to sell them in Europe? So how can you literally compete versus that? So if you're a policymaker or a business leader, sort of navigating this complex environment, how do you do that? So first of all, how can they do it? And then what is the counterattack for that?
I'll go first. I mean, they've been able to do it because wages in China have been very low so far, but they cannot do it forever. My answer to your colleague, and one of the challenges that China is finding, that as people get more education and get a better preparation, people are not willing to be working for under the same conditions that they had before. So comparatively speaking, for example, the first move of the US back in the 1990s was to outsource everything to Mexico. And China emerged as a great ideal location to be used instead of Mexico. Comparatively speaking, the economist argues that salaries have increased more rapidly in China than in Mexico. So there is an attractiveness of that because China eventually will be very difficult to be used because of labor costs will increase. But not only labor costs, moving costs. And just to give you an example, only with Europe. The most important market for Germany for their cars is China, as you may know. And they because of the war in Ukraine, that the route that they used to have, which was Germany, Poland, Belarus, Russia, Kazakhstan, and then China by train, has been disrupted. And now the companies, I think it's BMW and Audi, are having to ship their cars by a boat, which has two options or three options: South Africa, the Suez Canal, or the Panama Canal. So the cost will go up massively. So there is an incentive to think of other alternatives. And I think Latin America may be able to supply that. Mexico, perhaps. Chris?
Yeah, I would, I think, cover most of it. Just to say that China, where in those industries, those high labor, low cost industries, the sort of textiles and the like, they've begun to offshore those as well. So in Vietnam, Bangladesh, even in parts of other surprising markets in Ethiopia and the like, So some of the shoes, for instance, that you would be buying in Europe are actually made by Ethiopians in a Chinese company. So it's globalizing in ways, unexpected ways, in response to these rising costs.
Thank you very much. So essentially what they're doing is they're transitioning out of this aspect of being considered the factory of the world. Okay. All right. So
Yes,
let's
that's
go
right.
on to Professor Jesus.
My students, you remember Hofstede model, are Chinese long-term or short-term? Long-term, very well. Some of them are going to pass this subject. You know something, most people put the focus on the low labor cost. I think there's another reason, which is deeper in my opinion, which is mentality. Imagine your fixed and variable costs amount to 90. You're a European company and you're selling at 10, at 100, so you're making 10. You're a Chinese company, you're selling at 91. You're only earning 1. But then you're not selling 100. You're selling 1,000 or 10,000, and then you get that multiply, and you're getting much more profit. The point here is that we're used to have higher gross margin and higher net margin than the Chinese mentality. It's long-term, and they're ready to get low amounts. So even if the costs are growing up, it's also a mentality of how much do you put as a markup to your prices. I work as a consultant, and I always have to think, this is the consultancy hours that I have to put, plus the traveling. I'm going to Azerbaijan next Sunday, and I have to see the hotel, the trip, the hours that I'm going to be, my assistant, but then I have to put a markup. And I've seen in China, been in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, in Beijing, discussing with them that they're used to work with lower margins and multiply by many times. And that is not going to change, or not in the short term. So I agree with both professors that labor cost is very important, but to answer to your question, I will say also long-term mentality, low margins is a different way of doing business.
Do we have any other question? Okay, so here.
So, in order to close the session, I will kindly ask our colleagues to, or regarding one of the hottest topics that we have on talking about geopolitics and China and international trade, which is the South China Sea conflict. In your opinion, finally, or in the next years, what kind of situations could we see regarding the South China Sea conflict and the battle for trade?
Okay, so just to sort of repeat that question. Okay, so you're being asked, so it's regarding the South China Sea battle, okay, and then how it's going to sort of affect trade?
South China Sea trade.
The South China Sea trade.
Can I jump in with a short comment and then? I mean, the South China Sea this is actually an ongoing competitiveness, and it's about battle for sea lanes versus territoriality, the island strategy to build up positions. And by the way, China's not the only one that claims these. We have the Vietnamese, the Philippines. It's a very contested zone. And China's the dominant player of the region. Of course, the United States and others are exercising freedom of navigation, which is antagonistic, seen to be antagonistic. So it's this zone of competition. And yet we're also talking about an area of the world that is trade dependent and one which is very outward facing in terms of exports and export earnings. So this is there is a tension there between the territorial aspirations of China, the willingness of the United States to put and its allies to push back, and at the same time the needs to maintain this dynamic economic turnover that keeps the economies going. Probably the catalyst to this will probably stay in the way it is, except for one factor: Taiwan. If Taiwan if in different ways Taiwan either moves towards independence or China moves towards territorial acquisition, then I think all bets are off, and we're going to see something quite dramatic there. Alvaro, over to you.
Yes, I do think this is an ongoing issue that it goes way beyond what is happening right now. And I think this is an issue that will involve a lot of different countries. I would say that China is in the South China dilemma in the same way that they are in the Malacca dilemma, because the security tensions are there, but they also depend on these two areas, South China Sea and then the Malacca Strait through Singapore for their trade. And this is a very important issue. So it's sort of a balance between that. Having said that, China has been disenfranchised from the political dialogue at the international level, that I think they might be more bold or bolder in their decisions, in their political decisions now than they were before, now that they have so many tensions with the US. So what's the role of the European Union and the US? I think we have to find a way to de-escalate the tensions. I think that will be healthier for what's happening right now, but it's going to be a challenge. I know that the Chinese want that, but obviously in their own terms now. So that's going to be definitely a challenge, and that which is changing also because China is increasingly getting their sources for energy from Russia, bypassing the need to have these sources coming from the Middle East via the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for your time. I mean, what I'd like to do is just to summarize the key things that we've discussed. So essentially what all the panelists, thank you very much for your time as well and for your key contributions. So essentially what we've looked at is the complex relationship between China and Latin America. So I think the vast majority of times people think just because in terms of distance they're far away, but if you realize that they're quite intertangled in terms of relationship, okay? And then here, so we've seen how the relationship is going to evolve over time, what factors influence it, and then especially the key thing that I want to, what's important to us is the future of these regions. Okay, so thank you to all the panelists to help us understand these things. And then I think here the key things that I want the students to take away from this is the economic interests that have been mentioned by all the professors, the geopolitical considerations that we have to take into account, and the strategic importance, and then also the cultural exchange that takes place between all the different regions. Okay, so I'd like to thank everybody for being here, for sharing their contributions, and for your keen interest in the masterclass. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dan.
It was an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay. All right, so just to say one last thing, please buy the book, read it, you'll learn a lot.
Thank you. Pleasure to see you guys.